Hello everyone and welcome to the IFST Eastern Branch event titled The Potential Role of Nutrition in Delaying Mild Cognitive Impairment. My name is Steve Timms. I am Vice Chair of IFST Eastern Branch. IFST Eastern Branch aims to provide events throughout the year at which locally based experts and organisations within the food supply chain can share knowledge and provide insights. Today's webinar addresses the potential links between food science and the performance of our brain. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared on IFST's website. Feel free to make comments and ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. This can also be used in case of any technical difficulties. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation where we will respond to as many of these questions as possible, and I will ask our speaker your questions. Our speaker today is Dr. Rob Winwood. Next slide, please. As you can see from this slide, Rob has many career highlights, having been appointed chair and vice chair of a number of committees in his sector. And of course, I must highlight that Rob has been a continuous member of IFST for the past 43 years. So without further ado, I will hand over to Rob.
Many thanks indeed, Steve. Much appreciated. So what we're going to talk today is about a condition which is probably going to affect all of us at some time in our lives, and some people like me, maybe it already is. And what I want to do is give you a little bit of detail about what the condition actually is, but more importantly, what we can do as food scientists and food technologists perhaps to ameliorate it, perhaps delay it happening, and just generally improve the loss of older people generally. You know, it's not necessarily a bad thing. If it's, you know, when I find my slippers in the fridge, or if I find I've gone up top of the stairs and I can't remember what I've done that for, that's a sign of mild cognitive impairment. And as it sounds, not particularly awful in itself. But we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go by. I do have to say that I'm a doctor of food science and technology. I'm not a medical professional, so but I can't give you any medical advice. So let's just say a couple of things. I pulled this off as some statements, but this was a comment from a paper in the USA. But basically, one of the main risk factors for MCI, mild cognitive impairment, is poor nutrition. So I wanted to talk about that today, which I will. And the key thing is, of course, that if you do get mild cognitive impairment, it's one of the main risk factors for progression to various types of dementia, which would include things like Alzheimer's disease. Now, there's certainly the thing to remember here is the evidence for any single nutrient is certainly fairly small, but there is increasing evidence of that a sort of multiple effect of combined nutrients effect does indeed have some benefits in terms of cognitive health in the older people. And that's what we're going to be talking about mainly today. So here's the program of things we're going to be talking about. I'm going to give you some rough ideas of what MCI is about, and indeed what Alzheimer's disease is about. We'll talk about specifically what health claims are allowed in the European Union, and hopefully that still counts even after Brexit. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I will also look at individual nutrients which have been proposed in the literature as having specific benefits for MCI, and you see the list there. Then we'll move on to what I call the combo approach. Look, when we start combining all these things together and how that can actually be used, and particularly some commercial examples of how that's been done already. And then something completely new, I'm going to be reporting on a new study by Stephen Kinnane's research group up in Sherbrooke in Canada. He's been working for a long time on using medium chain triglycerides, short chain saturated fatty acids, as an alternative source for glucose in the brain, and this can make a really big difference. And again, you'll see why, and I'll be quite excited telling you a little bit more about that as we go. And then finally, I'll just sort of summarize and we'll go through. So MCI, prodromal Alzheimer's disease, what are we talking about here? Well, the first thing to say is that it's very common. If we look at Alzheimer's disease, it's something around 13% of people over the age of 65 are already suffering from that. Very importantly, despite over 200 human clinical trials being developed, there is no proven pharmacological intervention which will cure it or prevented or even really delayed a disease. So we don't really have any obvious way of treating it at the moment. But we can, there are a number of things that do help um, reduce the effects, and one of these are the nutritional approaches. So we'll talk about that and how that might be important. So let's talk a little bit about the aging brain. You know, the brain is very much like our other organs. As we get older, they're increasingly liable to malfunction, and what that really means is things like mental processing speed slow down. The memory becomes a little bit worse, short-term memory particularly. If we look at the brain itself, once we start developing mild cognitive impairment, then the brain will shrink at a rate of about 1% a year. That itself's not too bad. But if it should move on to full-blown dementia, to Alzheimer's disease, then the brain will be shrinking by a rate of 3% a year, which becomes considerably more serious. There is evidence in terms of delaying the onset of mild cognitive impairment. This can be generally that can be put down to living healthily, I like to say, and that includes good nutrition and exercise. They seem to be at least as effective as any pharmacological intervention. So I'm going to look at some specific interventions. But at the end of this, I want to say that as the brain gets older, it becomes increasingly starved of oxygen. It's better of glucose. It's just not able to use glucose as an energy source. And in MCI, that means that that's about 10% reduction in terms of MCI, and in terms of Alzheimer's, in fact, the use of glucose goes down to by some 50%. So finding an alternative energy to glucose is really important. And what we can say in all these conditions is that sugar, glucose, and these things are important. And it's worth remembering that Alzheimer's disease is sometimes referred to as type 3 diabetes. It very much has a link in terms of sugar in the diet. Okay, so looking at the brain a little bit, in terms of an organ, the brain's actually not that big. It's got about 1.4 kilos in weight. But despite that, it still uses some 20% of total energy intake. So having enough energy is really important. When we look at good nutrition, then particularly as you get aged 55 and older, it's very important to keep that good consensus of human nutrition up. The main risk factor as such for cognitive decline or indeed dementia is actually age. And again, as we said before, healthy lifestyle can help prevent that. So around about 1 in 5 people who have mild cognitive dementia, mild cognitive will actually move on to Alzheimer's disease. So a lot of the things that can be done to help prevent the onset of MCI will also help prevent the conversion to Alzheimer's as well. So that's important. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that your genes are really important here. Depending on if you happen to be homozygous carriers of the ApoE4 allele, if you have that, then you have a 10-fold increase in terms of risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So to a certain extent, there is a genetic predisposition to these conditions. So let's just move on. Let's talk a little bit about Alzheimer's disease, the more sort of serious form of these things. It's a disease which is a progressive degenerative disease and basically could be considered as brain wasting. And what happens is that you get various symptoms which include, you can see here, memory loss, disturbed mood, psychosis, depression, and loss of language. The main risk factors, as I already mentioned, is age and genetics, but also an imbalance of protective factors, and that includes the energy sources, which is why things like sugar are important. So let us move on. Just to say a little bit more about Alzheimer's disease, this was first described by Alois Alzheimer back in 1906. If you were to look at the brain of a person with Alzheimer's disease, you would see two specific things. You would see some things called amyloid plaques, which accumulate in the brain, and then another thing called intraneuronal neurofibrillary tangles. So these are things you can physically see, and these build up during time and are hallmarks of the disease. Unfortunately, there's not a particular link between the proportion of those and the condition of how the disease is progressing, but we always see those. Very important, the Alzheimer's brain itself is characterized by reduced insulin sensitivity, which is why the term type 3 diabetes is termed, and that means reduced uptake of nutrients generally. In terms of treatment, there was a drug called donazepam, developed in 1988, which is a cholinesterase inhibitor, was launched. But actually, this was extremely poorly tolerated, and it didn't really have any major effect at all. And so, as I've already mentioned, if we look literally up to sort of 2 or 3 years ago, 200 clinical trials and no real significant beneficial pharmacological intervention so far. However, developed countries have become, I think, more attuned to what's necessary for people who suffer Alzheimer's disease, and have been starting introducing things. They've basically said that things such as better exercise and reducing cardiovascular exercise and nutrition will all help in terms of preventing the onset of Alzheimer's. I mentioned the amyloid plaques and neurofibular tangles. Just so this is why, if you were able to look in the brain, this is just a quick image of how they would look. In terms of list of drugs which are around, which will prevent Alzheimer's disease progression, these are the kind of materials that will help with that, and they will help various degrees. But as I say, the effects are fairly small, and the way in which they're tolerated is not very good. But there's a list for you. I'd like to move on to brain health claims in the European Union, because if you're a food manufacturer, then you might rather like the idea of developing products for target markets for older people. But if you're going to do that, you have to make and you have to make a specific brain health claim. You have to fit in with the health claims regulations of 2006. And the first thing I need to say is a very small number of nutrients have actually received a positive opinion in terms of brain health. And it's particularly difficult actually to use hard endpoints in ways of studying brain function. This makes it difficult for new materials to receive brain claims of one form or another. The IFST did try and realize this, and in fact they've issued a whole series of guidelines back some 10 years ago for doing that, which will help. There aren't that many products at the moment that actually are targeted at this market. I've put on a couple here. There was a product made by Coca-Cola back some 5-6 years ago, which had an alkyl DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, in it for brain health. And then I've just shown one in Mexico, which is basically a cooking oil by a company called Bragasa, and again they've added DHA at a level which is focusing on brain health benefits, not particularly for the elderly for either of these cases, it's just for general brain health. But there is definitely a hole in the market as far as that's concerned. So I put together the various EFSA Article 13 claims which are applicable to cognitive health, and you can see a long list there. But if you look a bit more carefully, you will see they're either mainly B vitamins and a few specific trace elements there. The only other material you'll probably recognize is DHA. So these are the things which are, and the actual statement that appears on the pack of a pound of food is that it contributes to the maintenance of normal brain function. That's what, so it's not saying it improves anything, it's just helping things stay as they are. And there are a few others here, including water as part of the list there. However, perhaps one of the more surprising thing is to look at some of the things that haven't been approved in terms of brain claims. So you'll see again a list on the left here, including things such as choline and creatinine, which are generally still thought to have a beneficial effect. But the point is there's not sufficient evidence for EFSA to grant any kind of memory claim at the current time. So going back to that, there is draft guidance. If you want to start trying to go for a health claim, you need to follow this particular document that EFSA put out. And what they say is that the key thing is to look at the various markers, the kind of tests that will be applicable to get a brain claim. And that this is what this is basically telling you. So, for instance, if you're looking for effects on vision, then you're allowed to do a thing called a visual evoked potential. You're allowed to use telecards. But what are not considered would be macular pigment density. So it's very important to check this list before you start trying to make any application for a claim. I included one particular product, docosahexaenoic acid, and this is DHA, because the claims here are specific in terms of normal brain function, normal a maintenance of normal vision. And if you want to do that, then basically the EFSA panel says that you need to get 250 milligrams of DHA in one or more servings. In practical terms, that means if you're developing a food, it must, as a single dose must actually have a minimum of at least 30 milligrams. Just to look at some other products, which the ginkgo biloba is a product which is considered by many people to be beneficial for brain health, and indeed there have been a lot of studies. But the reality is a Cochrane review was done back in 2009, and when they looked at the big meta-analysis of over 36 studies, they couldn't see any over beneficial effect. So that sort of explains the problem and why ginkgo doesn't actually have a brain health claim at the moment. Now, there are various private studies being done which seem to do seem to offer a benefit, but as I say, at the moment, there's no approved health claim at the moment. Things are certainly still carrying on in terms of meta-analysis. There was one just done this year, so I thought I'd put this into the study. This is one which was done in Southeast Asia. And it was interesting in that it was conducted very carefully using the Cochrane database guidelines and the PRISMA guidelines. So it's a very good study indeed. It looked at 18 randomized controlled trials. But in terms of all the various large number of ingredients it looked at, only B vitamins and the omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA, seem to have any significant effect in terms of reducing cognitive decline. Important in terms of B vitamins, then the intervention was only successful in people who had high homocysteine levels, and we'll talk about homocysteine a bit further on. In terms of EPA and DHA, then the sort of benefits that happened in terms of people who had MCI, that they got improved attention and in terms of orientation. In the East Asia, there are various products which are particularly put out that are meant to have benefits like soy isoflavine and chicken essence, but again, there were no benefits seen for those products in this particular population in Southeast Asia. So moving on, some of the individual nutrients which have been proposed as having a benefit for MCI patients are listed here. So you've got carotenoids, resveratrol, vitamin E, B vitamins, choline, DHA, and medium chain triglycerides. And we're going to look at some, though not necessarily all of those. Beta carotene is one of interest. There's a study going on called the CARE study in Ireland. Professor John Nolan's been working on this for some time, and he's been looking specifically at Alzheimer's patients. So carotenoids are very potent antioxidants, and they are known to pass the blood-brain barrier. So not so many things you eat actually get through to the brain cells. So this is important. And what he did in this particular group of Alzheimer's patients was apply a nutrition intervention which had 10 milligrams of lutein, 10 milligrams of mesozeaxanthin and zeaxanthin, and then a couple of omega-3s as well in terms of DHA and EPA. And basically the outcome was this: they said that there was a delay in the general progression of Alzheimer's disease, and that carers specifically reported that their patients had better memory, sight and mood. So there seems to be some definite benefits going on there. And this study is now coming onto a much larger scale study which started very recently, and hopefully we'll get some positive results out of that. So it just shows the sort of the way which diet can be used in research at the moment. Resveratrol is a product which is often claimed to have brain health. Resveratrol is found particularly in red wines, in strong red wines, and it has been shown to decline the sort of decline in brain cells generally in animal models. And if you look at epidemiological studies, the populations which seem to have a moderate or larger consumption of red wine do indeed seem to have a low incidence of dementia and MCI. So there seems to be something there. And again, in terms, there have been various things proposed about how resveratrol might work, and one of those is that it seems to reduce the amount of those intercellular amyloid beta peptides that we saw before. Also, we know that caloric restriction in terms of a diet, I think, will help generally reduce age-related diseases, and it seems to be the same mechanism that resveratrol has in terms of that. So this all looks quite promising, but again, we don't have any specific claims as yet for resveratrol. But it may be one of those things we want to look at. Vitamin E is another antioxidant. And studies were done all the way back over 20 years ago using the pharmacological agents as selegiline with vitamin E. And there did seem to be some effects in terms of patients who had moderately severe Alzheimer's disease, some benefit there. Other studies have been done since there with, again, using a sort of combo approach with the pharmacological agents, so vitamin E and donepezil in MCI, and again with memantine as well. So, and again, so there were benefits seen. I had to say fairly small benefits, but definitely the combo approach of those pharmacological agents with vitamin E seemed to help. So putting the two things together did show benefit. Homocysteine, I think I mentioned before, is important in looking at the liability of whether it really people who are suffering MCI or Alzheimer's disease do show marked higher homocysteine levels. And so if you can control those levels and reduce homocysteine levels, it's generally regarded as a good thing. There's been a particular study going on at Oxford University for some 30 years now called the Optimus study, looking at ways in which we might increase the homocysteine levels. And one of the things they found quite early on was that B vitamins helped, and specifically folate and vitamin B12 seem to actually physically reduce the rate of brain shrinkage. So this was an important thing. They also found, as we mentioned before, a genetic effect in terms of the propensity to have high levels of homocysteine in the first place. And again, if we start looking at, particularly if we look at the particular sort of genetic makeup which allows that, we can see that people who have the worst genetic makeup had a 46% risk of cognitive impairment greater than those of other genetics. So genetics does play a very important part of all this. So moving on then to specifically to B vitamins, it's not everything that seems to have a benefit. The ones that seem to help particularly are vitamin B6, peroxidin, B12 and folate. That seems particularly important in this. And one of the things we definitely know that if you have low plasma concentration, blood plasma concentrations of B vitamins, then these are a risk factor for the onset of dementia. We also know that if you have deficiency of B12, we know that reduces generally cognitive performance in humans. And also we now know that research indicates that older people probably need more of B12 going forward. The chemistry still needs to be sorted out to some degree, but basically, if you look at 1-carbon-methionine chemistry, that seems to be the key role in the way in which B vitamins work. And I think that's probably why they interact in terms of other nutrients that we're going to talk about later. There was a specific study called the VitaCog study, which was carried out by that Oxford group, where they used a mixture of folate, vitamin B12 and vitamin C6 for 2 years. And what they saw was a reduction in brain atrophy. And just wanted to show that's what you can see at the bottom part of the slide there. And basically you can see the effect of a beneficial amount of taking that particular supplement. You basically more brain activity. I think it's very important to say that actually, in terms of the protection of B vitamins, one of the things they've already found is that in terms of omega-3 fatty acid protection, then you need to have B vitamins there as well to offer any protection at all. So there's certainly some interaction going on there, and we'll see where that develops to. The same studies are still going on. This is a very recent one, again, carried out at Ulster University by the group of Catherine Hughes. And in this case, they were able to recognize that vitamin B6 deficiency correlated with more rapid rates of cognitive decline in a large population in Northern Ireland. So it definitely seems to be that you need to have both vitamins B6, 9 and 12 and sufficient EPA and DHA to have an effect. And this is a study which was replaced by Ohaj et al. By an Alzheimer's disease some 5 years ago, just giving those studies. So another material which I think is very important is choline. Lots of choline, it's high, large amounts of that in the brain. And we know that it's important. If we know that people who've studied, a number of studies are out there showed improved cognitive test performance after the consumption. If we look at it practically, choline itself is the direct precursor of acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is very important because that's the neurotransmitter that's important in the brain. So if you have a lot of that, that means there's more likely to be decline in terms of general brain health and in terms of risk of various brain-related diseases. So what we can say is if there are increasing plasma choline levels, then this is actually going to result in enhanced acetylcholine release from activated cholinergic neurons, which is very important. So we have a number of studies which you can see in the list there. I won't spend too much longer on those, but you can see the numbers that have been done on that. So it does seem that choline it could be very beneficial and in terms of providing sort of some help in this particular route. And again, if we look at, it's very important to look at how the particular trials are conducted. But you'll always see, if you look at the various nutrient combos which are aimed at brain health at the moment, you'll see choline is often included in those, which are targeted at people that are 65 or over. And what I did here was just look at particularly neurological performance, taking data from the very well-known Framingham study. And if you look at that, you can see improvements in verbal memory and visual memory definitely seem to correlate in terms of higher levels of choline. So that's a kind of sort of interesting population data, but what we don't have are the randomized controlled trials to back that up at the moment. Hopefully we will in the future. I've already mentioned DHA, docosahexaenoic acid. This is an omega-3 fatty acid that's specifically important for the brain. It's something that's really only found in the marine environment. And if you look at it, it's found at particularly high levels in the human body in terms of the brain, retina, and the heart and reproductive organs. What's unique about it as from a chemical point of view is that it has 6 double bonds in it, and it gives them the molecule incredible flexibility, and that flexibility is very important in terms of the way in which it functions in terms of neural cell walls. It allows all sorts of things to happen, particularly it allows messages to go in and out from internal to the cell and between cells. That material represents some sort of 10 to 15% of the total fat of the brain, so quite a lot of it. And we need to get that from external sources, and there are not so many places you can get it from. As I already mentioned, the marine environment is probably the best one. It's particularly important. It's found in the very front of the brain, the frontal cortex, also very deep in the brain. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner there, that sort of seahorse-looking structure is the hippocampus. Again, there's high levels of DHA in there. So it's thought to be important for executive memory, working memory, spatial memory, and what we call declarative memory formation. We're not entirely sure how it works, but we believe that DHA helps facilitate electrical transmission between the neurons. We also do know that it's the source of several essential what we call brain messenger compounds, which also happen to be anti-inflammatory. So these are things like D-series resolvins, merasins, and neuroprotectins. Some other things happen as well. Rather interestingly, DHA seems to preserve the telomere length of DNA. So basically, as you get older, the telomeres, which are part of genes, shrink with age, but it seems that DHA is one of the things that helps prevent that. We do know DHA is very effective in preventing free radical damage in terms of brain cells. And there are a number of other theories why it might be of some importance. In terms of trials, has DHA been used in large-scale trials? And the answer to that is yes, it has, with, I suppose you could say, mixed results. One very positive one was on mild cognitive impairment by the group of Yokomura et al., where the population there was given 900 milligrams of DHA for some 6 months, and then using specific tests using what we call a cognitive test battery called the Cantab test battery, there was then to see that they were indeed able to reverse the mild memory impairment effects by literally, in this particular, by the effect of some 3 years. So if you had the memory of someone who was 69, it reduced it back down to 66. So that's a real positive benefit there. However, when we came on to doing the same sort of thing for Alzheimer's patients, even using a much higher dose, in this case 2 grams a day, for a total of 19 months, the overall, there was no benefit shown to the treatment. However, at that time, we didn't know the importance of genetic effects. So when later, in a post hoc study, we looked at the effect of people who did and didn't have the ApoE14 allele, then indeed we did start seeing a benefit there. And it's interesting to know that since that time, the studies now do make very careful looking at the what the genetic constitution of the population is before they do the test. So we have something that looks positive there going forward. And I mentioned the importance of the genetic thing. So it's the ApoE4 gene that's particularly important. And if you are unfortunate to have ApoE4, it does, we know, increase the risk of various diseases, including Parkinson's and cardiovascular disease, and as we already mentioned, Alzheimer's disease. We beginning to understand what is happening here, and we believe that it's affecting it with glucose dysregulation. Comes back to that type 2 diabetes again. It's also associated with obesity and specifically accumulation of amyloid beta. So quite a lot of things going on there. And what I've shown you there is there's a diagram that shows the specific interaction on chromosome 19, which seems to be important in preventing some of these results. And if you want to look further, you can look at the study of Yessing and Finch, which was reported last year. Studies are still going on. I pulled this one out of the sort of food journals by Ichino's et al. In the Journal of Functional Foods. Here we are looking at elderly Japanese who were supplied just with a 200 milliliter sort of low-fat milk beverages for a year. So there weren't particularly high levels of omega-3s in here. I mean, the levels here only just meet the European requirements. And they then looked at how they assess people in terms of various states, including the fairly standard millimental state examination, MSA, but also a couple of Japanese studies as well. And basically what they found was that though there didn't seem to be any overall difference between the two, between the intervention group and the control, there was a significant reduction in terms of the reduction of short-term memory in the DHA intervention arm. And that's quite a remarkable result considering the dose there is, as I say, really quite low. And I think for me that's important because it means that if we can get DHA into food products, we may actually be, even at fairly low levels, maybe actually be able to make a difference here. And that brings me on to the study of what we can do as food technologists. And before I started doing this study, I looked at the websites of various food trade organizations looking at nutrition for the elderly, and they really mention extremely little. They certainly don't talk about Alzheimer's or MCI, and any advice that's given is very, very general indeed, which is a shame because I think I've already shown there are particular ingredients that do seem to help. And perhaps some other things. We also know that high sugar levels in food aren't going to be good. They're just definitely a risk factor for onset of MCI and Alzheimer's disease. So that's something we can do. Also, we have, as food technologists, I think over the last 30 years or so, we've tried to cut out saturated fats. Again, perhaps that's a rather ignorant position because, as I'm going to show you very shortly, some of the short medium-term fatty acids are actually really important in terms of brain health. And so it means the products which may have been considered unhealthy, particularly things like cheese and dairy products, actually might be highly beneficial. So perhaps we should go back to considering those. Anyway, so let's move on with the show's file. I just want to look at the sort of combination products which are out there. So this, just to show you that there already are what I would call foods for special medical purposes, which have been, and obviously there needs to be a sort of randomized control to back these up. So there's been a thing called the lipid diet going on for a number of years, conducted across Europe, specifically coordinated by the University of East Finland. And this uses a combination of the various nutrients which we've already seen and for a long period of time in terms of patients with mild cognitive impairment. The issue here is that actually up to the 2-year study didn't really seem to show a great deal of benefits, which is a bit of a shame. But just to put out, this is already available as a product in pharmacies around the country, and you can see what it contains on the list there. And a lot of the materials we've already mentioned are mentioned there, and you can see on the left-hand side the sort of full declaration of what's there. So this is a small sort of drink. You just take have a one-off, have one at a time. However, whereas I was a little bit negative about this, I'm rather pleased to say that the most recent results from the lipid randomized control trial were released in November. And then we start seeing some real benefits. So this multi-nutrient intervention did definitely show a significant decline in terms of cognition, brain atrophy, and disease progression. So, and that decline was actually pretty big in terms of the various, and we saw a 76% reduction in terms of memory and executive function in terms of decline. So that's really rather important. And they also looked using they were able to look at the brain itself, and in that case they were able to see physically into the brain that there was less decline in terms of the deterioration in the intervention arm. So these really do indicates that there's benefits with increase with long-term use. So this, remember, is at the 3-year front. So I think it's a very positive thing going forward. And just to bank that forward, I would urge you to have a look yourself, but you can see the effect here quite markedly. So we have the decline. The normal decline is the red line on these slides, sorry, it's the blue line, and the active with the Suvanade is the red line. And you can see that in all the cases, in terms of the memory, brain volume, you can see a considerable improvement in terms of reducing that decline when Suvanade is consumed. So I think that's really, really very positive thing. And we can see a little bit more in terms of the studies there, again, looking at that going forward. Okay, the final thing I want to talk about is a study with supplementation of the diet with medium chain triglycerides. And for this, just to tell you a little bit about where medium chain triglycerides come from in the diet. And here we're looking really at the very short-term saturated fatty acids, which are found particularly in dairy products. So these are carbon 6, carbon 8, and carbon 10 fatty acids, known as caprylic and capric acid. And these are particularly found in milks, particularly in goat's milk, but there's a small amount also in cow milk. So basically it's found in grass-fed animals. And the name actually, caprylic comes from the name capra for goat, in case you wondered. The reason for telling you about that is a study which has been recently put out by Professor Stephen Pumain of the University of Sherbrooke in Quebec, Canada. And he's been working on this area for a long period of time. And I remember being at a conference some 6-7 years ago, and everything I heard about the prevention of Alzheimer's disease, prevention of MCI was negative, except for this one study, which basically suggested that there was an important role to be played by medium chain triglycerides. And this got me very interested, and I'm pleased to say that Stephen has persisted with that work and now come up with some what I think are some very important results. And there are products out there which include medium chain triglycerides. This is again a sort of a product put out which you can get in pharmacies called Brain Expert from the Nestle company. And you can see on the left-hand side there the content of medium chain triglycerides. So it's actually quite high. So you've got 15 grams of the medium chain triglycerides in every 25 grams, but that's some 60%. So it's not something that can be done in a normal food product. So looking at the article here, here we have one that's reported in terms of the results of a 6-month study, and this is what we're going to talk about. So basically what we have is that these medium chain triglycerides are used as an energy source for the brain. They provide ketones, which are used by the brain when it's not able to get glucose. The study itself is called the BENEFIC study, and what's important here is those short chain fatty acids, caprylic and capric acid, are able to cross the blood-brain barrier, and they produce the specific ketones, acetoacetate, and also beta-hydroxybutyrate. These are important things in terms that the brain can actually use as an alternative energy source. So if we go back to where this comes from, actually human infants, when babies are always in a state of what we call mild ketosis. And this is because ketones are actually produced in the mother's milk. So they have a really big source of ketosis, and that's why they use that for energy. And in fact, infants use some 30% of energy requirements derived from that. But as the human matures, then we have less and less reliance on ketones, and we use glucose instead. So we've shown that ketones are actually particularly important in terms of energy for the brain, and we can say that ketone uptake itself is important in terms of increased level of white matter in the brain. So we can actually see that in some of the work which is performed. So this is what's happened in terms of up on the left-hand side there, you've got the control, patients with MCI, and at the bottom, patients with Alzheimer's disease. And what we're looking at is glucose uptake. So this is basically the patients have received glucose source, which has been has a radioactive tracer in it, and we can start to see what's happened. And what happens, those green lines mention where you've got deficiencies in terms of glucose. So you can start seeing at MCI, we start getting an increase and in terms of deficiency. And then we go to Alzheimer's disease, you can see a lot more of the green coloration, which means significantly lower amounts of glucose in the brain. And then if we start seeing what happens in terms of the ketone level, then we start seeing that there's not that you don't see the decrease, and indeed we start seeing some increases in terms of ketones. So ketones seem to be generally throughout both the control MCI and AD seem to still be used quite effectively as an energy source by the brain, whereas you can see with the glucose we had lots of yellow showing that this is not so much there. So that all looks very promising. And the way in which Stephen tries to explain this is saying that really the brain acts like a sort of hybrid car. It can use either glucose or ketones as a source. The normal in terms of adults is somewhere around up to 70 to 95% glucose, and ketones is normally 5 to 30%. But what happens is that in terms of mild cognitive impairment, the ability to use glucose goes down about 10%. When we start getting mild Alzheimer's, it goes down to 20%. So what we really need to do is to provide more ketones in the diet to provide it an alternative, because what we do know is the brain is still absolutely able to use ketones, whereas it can't use glucose. So the trial here involved active use of the an intervention of the mild change of events. And so they had an oral supplementation which contained 50 milligrams a day of the million chain triglycerides twice a day. And then they provide both magnetic resonance imaging of the brain and various cognitive evaluations of looking at that trial. And here's some of the things that happen. So in terms of ketone response, you can see that in the graph. On the right-hand side, again, you can see that there was a twofold increase in terms of the actual amount of ketones in the brain. So it worked in terms of getting it there. Did it work practically? Well, here's some tests of episodic memory, executive memory, and language. And you can see in each case, the blue dots represent an considerable improvement in terms of those brain functions. So the answer is yes, it seems that it really does. And we can look at that again with these results as well. So this is really promising work. So what we have is we believe there's a strong mechanistic link then between increased ketone level and the cognitive benefit, particularly for MCI patients. And that's basically what we are seeing in this schematic here. So yeah, we can basically correct that brain energy loss in MCI patients and Alzheimer's patients to some degree, and that's going to have a benefit in terms of executive function and language. And it may also help delay that progression from MCI to Alzheimer's disease. So that's really important in terms of a very basic. So just in terms of a summary, I think we're beginning to understand what are the basics behind MCI and how nutrition begins to play a role. We're also now beginning to understand the importance of the genetics concerning this. And some of them, we understand that it's basically mitochondrial dysfunction, energy starvation, and these things are really important with neurological dysfunction in older people. If we look at it from a biochemical point of view, the key part here is probably one, carbon metabolism, and glucose uptake are particularly important. I've also shown that ketones are particularly important in terms of providing an alternative energy reserve to glucose for the elderly brain. We're now also beginning to see a number of studies done with alternative things like B vitamins and choline, which can actually improve one carbon metabolism. So looking at combos does seem to be something that has a considerable promise in terms of therapies, in terms of MCI generally. I'd just like to thank Dr. Karen Yerkomero and Professor Norman Saylor, my former colleagues at DSM, who did provided a lot of the sort of original research into this area, and particularly, of course, to Professor Stephen Cunnane and his research, which were particularly important, and permitting me to use his slides on the BENEFIC trial, and also to Professor Hilka Soininen, Professor of East Finland, so I could report on her work on the lipid D diet. So thank you very much for that. Thank you very much. And if you want to hear the references, there's a few of them there, just some of the examples. If you want the long list, it goes into the hundreds, but that will give you some of the important important things for me as well. And at this point, I'd like to turn over to the Q&A session.
Okay, thank you, Rob, for such an interesting presentation. We're now moving on to today's Q&A session. There have been some really interesting questions that have been submitted. And I'd just like to remind you that you can still submit questions using the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. You may need to hover over your screen if using a mouse or touch your screen. Let's move on to the first question. So, Rob, is there any evidence on the effect of vitamin D on cognitive function?
Well, I'm not sure. Vitamin D probably not so much so. The vitamins are hot. Vitamin B's definitely, and I think we showed that during the study. So vitamin D is more related to other functions, things like lung function, upper respiratory effect, that kind of thing. It is important in that vitamin D is should be thought of more as a hormone, perhaps, rather than a vitamin. So it has a number of different functions, and it would be surprising if it didn't have some brain function at all. But that's not been specifically addressed in any trial that I've looked at, and I don't know any specific studies. So other vitamins, certainly, the range of B vitamins are important, but no, I can't say specifically vitamin D, no.
Okay. And do vegetarians and vegans have increased risk of developing MCI and Alzheimer's disease?
That's very good, important. Yeah, one of the strange things, obviously, if you are adopting a particular dietary habit which prevents you eating particular things, then you could be more at risk. And we see that generally in the vegetarian diet. So people who are sort of serious about the vegan and vegetarian diet will usually take supplements of some form or other, including specifically, you will normally see B vitamins and normally omega-3 fatty acids. And I think, as we've already shown in this presentation, those particular things seem to be important in terms of maintaining brain health in the elderly. So I think it's a question of, if you are serious about being a vegan and vegetarian, then you look at where there might be some deficiencies in terms of having an overnutrition, and you can still address those. And that applies to the elderly as well. But yes, there are certain things that seem to be there. And what, again, I think I've shown in the diet that if we look at those medium chain triglycerides, for instance, they seem to be, they're usually found in particular high levels in dairy products. So if you can't have dairy products, again, there's an issue there. But then these things can be made synthetically or extracted from other ways and can be provided then for people who want to follow a vegan and vegetarian diet. So yeah, I suppose the only other thing I would say is that the brain is very, very flexible, and we have seen in some populations that in fact the brain is able to adapt to the function in slightly different ways to overcome deficiencies of some of these products. But that's a story for another time, I think.
Okay, and moving on to another question, Rob. Can brain cells produce ketone bodies?
Well, that's a slightly different one. In the effect, normally what happens is there is some metabolism. So the medium chain triglycerides cross the blood-brain barrier, and then they are able to form things like acetoacetate. So that's where the specific ketones that are helpful for the brain are formed. So the important thing is that the MCTs themselves uniquely are small enough to actually cross the blood-brain barrier. Then they indeed can be converted in neural tissue. So in effect, I suppose you can say yes, they are.
Okay, and thinking further about MCTs, are there any plant-based sources of MCTs?
The problem here is not that they aren't produced. We're talking about very generally available fatty acids, so which is just short chain, so C6, C8, C10 saturated fatty acids. So those are around a number of things. So things like, if we take things like coconut oil, for instance, will have some. The problem is it's not necessarily enough. I think I mentioned that the intervention so far, we're using things like sort of 15 grams per intervention. Those sort of levels are not going to be found in cooking oils. But however, that being said, perhaps some of the cooking oils which have been sort of demonized in recent times, things like palm oil and coconut oil, do indeed contain some, and a little will always help. So that's what I was mentioning, that sometimes we need to look again at some of the things which we have tried to omit from the diet and taken out of some of the foods that we use, perhaps we should be looking at a different again for older populations.
Okay, and here's an interesting question. Can you speak a little about alcohol and its role in washing out EPA and DHA from the brain?
Yeah, it's one of the things that it unfortunately does. One of the things that alcohol does seem to do. Again, it does cross the blood-brain barrier, and it does indeed seem to sweep out certain nutrients. Again, how important this is and how significant this is, I wouldn't like to comment, but I have heard of that effect, and I'm aware of it. So it's probably not something that that's going to help. Having said that, I'm afraid it's not going to stop me having a beer or two.
Glad to hear it. Thinking back to your commentary about DHA and it being mainly from a marine source, in the ideal diet, can you say about how much fish per week is recommended?
Well, we've got to be very careful here. It needs to be oily fish. Just unfortunately, the sort of general white fish doesn't have a lot in it. And also, ideally, it should be wild fish. Unfortunately, around 90% of the fish we eat these days is farm fish, and progressively the levels of DHA have fallen over the last 10 years quite significantly. So it's quite unfortunately the problem here is you just don't know what you're eating. If you go to look in your local supermarket and see how much DHA it has in a particular, say, salmon bill, often it's not there. I have to say Sainsbury's are good. They do it, but not everybody does. So it's difficult to know how much you're actually getting. And the other thing I would say is that you really need to have a regular amount every day. So unless you're going to have, say, a bit of salmon every day, it's not necessarily going to be that beneficial. The government guidelines tend to just say 1 or 2 portions a week. And unfortunately, that's not the way it should be. You need a regular amount every day, really. So personally, what I do is have a supplement. I know that's not what everybody wants to do, but at least that way I know I get a regular amount every day. And I've been increasing it as I get older. So as I'm 62 now, I actually have between 1.5 and 2 grams a day of omega-3 fatty acids. That's both DHA and EPA, because I believe EPA has some role as well.
Okay, great. And moving on, if somebody in your family is diagnosed with MCI, what would be your top 3 tips to advise them to do with their nutrition?
Yeah, it's difficult. It's not one thing on its own. One thing we have learned is that lots of things going on. But what I would definitely say is be active. Get the person out walking, doing things, and make sure they do that. And then in terms of nutrition, just being aware of sort of the risk factors. So reduce the amount of sugar in the diet. We know that's a problem. We now can see that increasing those short chain fats is better. So have more dairy products, have a bit of cheese, why not? And it wouldn't, so you don't have to make major changes, but just to be aware. But I would say reducing overall sugar levels, reducing that glucose level is important. So that can be done. And then look at those other things, those other products I mentioned. So plenty of B vitamins, which you can get from sort of flour farinaceous products. And again, we mentioned if you can get people to have oily fish, that's great. But otherwise, perhaps get a product which has been fortified with the omega-3 fatty acids, specifically the marine omega-3 fatty acids, DHA and EPA.
Okay, I remember a slide you showed, Rob, with a goat on it as a symbol
Yes.
of the source of the products. I eat a lot of goat's cheese. Is that going to protect me from dementia?
If you eat enough of it, yeah, I think it probably would. I have to admit, since I started doing this and talking to Stephen, I buy my goat cheese regularly every week, because I enjoy it, but it's yeah, for that very reason. It's one of those cases where you have lots of little effects, and then perhaps if you build them all together, hopefully we'll have a bigger effect. I think that's the nature of this thing. One thing on its own is not going to do anything, but goat cheese is only going to be helpful. So yeah, let's all have a bit more goat cheese.
Great, okay, glad to hear it. And thinking back to your mention of ketones, and obviously we're food scientists, we're interested in food. Can you say something about what products are readily available in UK supermarkets that contain higher levels of ketones?
Well, again, is the same story comes out. The ketones themselves, not really, because they're fairly specific materials. As I said, the conversion happens in the brain. So it's the source is the medium chain triglycerides. That's where the ketones come from. Your body will very effectively convert them to ketones once you have that. So that's the important thing. So anything which has those low those low short chain fats. So that does mean, as we already mentioned, it means the basically dairy products, but any animal which eats grass and has got sort of multi-segmented stomach is going to start producing those particular short-chain fatty acids. So again, it's mostly dairy products. But I already mentioned there are some vegetarian alternatives. I've already mentioned things like palm oil and coconut oil. Those will have higher amounts as well. But again, it's just the levels there are small, but everything put together will be helpful.
Okay. And are people with pernicious anemia more likely to suffer dementia or Alzheimer's?
I'm not sure I can comment on that. I mean, iron is important for brain function. So if you're suffering from anemia, I can see that will be a problem. Also, there's relation there with B vitamins. So I can understand there might be relation, but I'm not qualified to comment on that. I'm not aware of clinical trials in that particular area.
Okay. Is it possible, could you expand on the idea that Alzheimer's is a form of diabetes?
Yeah, it's the key thing about we have type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So we have type 1 is basically something you're usually born with. Type 2 is something that happens usually with increased sugar level and reduced activity. When we talk about type 3 diabetes, we're specifically talking about the effects of the brain, and in terms of a change in terms of metabolism. So the fact that the brain becomes less able to use glucose as an energy source. And bear in mind that we've mentioned that the brain really it's really energy hungry. It's got to have that. It's going to take that from any other organ in the body. The brain will always come first. So if you start starving it, then it's going to start having problems. It's going to start misfunctioning. So that's really what we're talking about. We're saying that the brain itself, that condition is that the brain is less able to uptake. So it doesn't matter how much glucose is there, it's just less able to do it. And unfortunately, that's a result of diet during earlier years. So it's important, as we're all trying to do these days, reduce our overall sugar content, because it does put us at risk. Yeah.
Thanks, Rob. I think just time very quickly for a last final question. Do you consider our diet today more or less likely to protect us from MCI than 100 years ago?
It's one of those strange things. Obviously, people 100 years ago didn't tend to live that long, but now we're regularly getting people into their 90s and even way over 100. So we're seeing things that are rather different. Ironically, probably the diet was actually a lot healthier then. We probably consumed a lot more, for instance, of dairy products. If we look at the oil content, the fat side of things generally, we now have many fold more in terms of vegetable oils rather than meat and dairy fat. So that's going to be a problem. And we do know, unfortunately, that vegetable oils contain particular fatty acids, which tend to mean that there's less uptake of the important marine omega-3 fatty acids, DHA and EPA. So you don't find those in vegetable oils normally. So yeah, I think there is an issue. We do also consume a lot more sugar, of course. So all these things that I've mentioned before have changed a lot in the last 100 years. So if people have been able to live and weren't struck down by various communicable diseases back 100 years ago, there probably would have been a much less risk of getting Alzheimer's. But unfortunately, they didn't get that far.
Very interesting. Rob, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone from across the globe for attending the webinar today. If we didn't manage to answer your questions, please contact Rob directly. His details should be on the screen now. If you would like to catch up on any past IFST webinars, please do visit www.ifst.org/webinars. Finally, we would like to remind those of you not familiar with IFST that you can find useful resources on our website, including our COVID-19 Knowledge Hub and online Food Science and Technology magazine. We welcome new members, so please check our membership benefits page on the IFST website. Thank you so much again, Rob, and thank you everyone for attending today. Goodbye.
Bye.